Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. This week, I went to Minneapolis, Minnesota, after the death of Alex Pretty happened on Saturday, shot to death at point-blank range by, we think, two federal agents who have as yet to be identified. That, of course, follows the shooting death at point-blank range of Renee Good. In both cases, the Trump administration immediately moved to slander, smear, insult, degrade the people that their government officials had killed, domestic terrorists, assassins, etc. This has caused enormous outrage, despair, anger, political problems for the White House. And I had not done a show on the road in a really long time, but felt like it was really important to go there, and was there for a few days and got to talk to a bunch of people. And I was also there with two of my really good friends and colleagues, Alex Wagner, who's MS Now senior political analyst, also host of the podcast Runaway Country for Crooked Media, and Jacob Soboroff, who's an MS Now senior political and national reporter. And the three of us were all there together, kind of taking all this in. And there was way more than I could get on the show, and more that I had to say. A lot of what I reported, and we'll talk about this, was really hard to get on camera on it for reasons that'll become clearer as we talk. But I just felt like I wanted to sit with me, Alex, and Jacob had a drink at the bar on the last night that we were there, and we're just kind of debriefing everything. And I was like, oh, well, we should just do this because I still have there's still a lot rattling around my head. So Alex and Jacob, it's great to have you on.
Thanks, man. We're missing the drinks, but it's
true.
It's great to be here.
A little Club Shay Shay action. So I'll go first with like the thing that I've been telling people about, the thing that was the most, I don't know, surprising to me, or not surprising. The thing I didn't quite fully appreciate until I got there was the palpable sense of fear, and almost it felt sometimes like paranoia from people there in Minnesota. That was a product that turned out to be totally rational. That was a product of essentially the imposition of a kind of police state surveillance architecture. You know, I had someone talk to me about being followed by federal agents. I had someone talk to me about federal agents. And again, I'm saying federal agents because we never know if it's ICE, or it could be ICE, it could be CBP, it could be HSI. There's a bunch of sort of alphabet agencies in DHS. So we'll just say DHS, federal agents. But federal agents coming up to someone who's at a school patrol, like in the green vest, on the block of the school, to make sure ICE doesn't roll up on students or parents at drop off, and having those agents take out his camera and like take pictures of all of their faces. Like clearly, provocatively, like, we're putting you in the database. The New York Times today reports a woman who is being tailed by a federal agent who gets out of the car and approaches her car knowing her name because he got her name and face out of a federal database. I've heard stories from medical providers about ICE in disguises, or not like obviously ICE sitting and parking in emergency room parking lots. And what it manifested as is you would deal with people and they didn't want to be on camera. They were super freaked out and suspicious. If my cameraman went ahead of me to a location where we were going to go try to talk to people, and again, I've been a reporter for 25 years. I've gotten pretty good at this point in my life of like rolling up to someone and being like, hey, how you doing? Like, I'm here to report. But the car was sitting idling across the street and people lost their mind. And what was so intense about it was like, oh, this is what it's like to live in a not free society. Like, it was a glimpse of that in a way that I have to say, and I'm curious what you guys think, because I've been talking too long. Like, I've never encountered anything quite like that anywhere I've reported. That sense of like pervasive menace and surveillance.
I was like, I don't have anybody in my family that went through the Holocaust, but my stepfather is Dutch, and he always talks about his mother shielded some Jews from the Nazis in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands. And I always kind of wondered what it would be like. I mean, obviously to be hunted, but also to be working in the resistance against the state, and what that would feel like, and what those networks were like. And when I went to Minneapolis, I was talking to this mom who has organized a 100 plus person network of chauffeurs to get teachers from their homes to schools, to get groceries to the teachers' homes, to deliver toys to the children of the teachers who can no longer go to school. These are all teachers that belong in the country, that have their papers, but teach at a Spanish language immersion preschool and do not feel safe basically going to and from work. That preschool also has those parent patrols you talk about, Chris, where they're parents on guard in their own sort of homemade vests, watching to see if ICE is going to run up on the school. And it dawned on me that, okay, this is what it looked like. Like, you just had these self-directed, self-created networks. They didn't have spreadsheets back in the 1930s and 40s, but they have them now. And it was like, these people have created these grassroots networks of, safety for people who shouldn't. None of it was merited then, and it's not merited now. But it's like, this is what the resistance looked like. It's this homespun secret networks, and the shroud of secrecy is, as you point out, so profound, right? Like, this is Minnesota, and nobody wants to be on camera. Nobody wants their last names used. People are terrified of Signal. People were terrified of Alex Preddy's handle on Signal being used by the feds because they grabbed his phone after they shot and killed him. And they were worried about what networks that exposed, because he was obviously communicating on Signal. I mean, now the administration is looking into Signal chats, trying to get at these activists who are working to resist ICE. So the paranoia is totally legitimate and totally warranted. But it was so eye-opening and terrifying that kind of Gestapo-like, shadow circuitry was in place in an American city, and that we were just kind of, and the bravery of those people, the insanity of the situation, and also it was life-affirming for me too. It was like, oh shit. This is what it's like to really, we say the word resistance all the time, but this is what it looks like to fucking resist.
And I'll get to you in a second, Jacob, but I just want to say that, like, I had the same thought, and there would be moments where I would feel like, this feels all a little dramatic, guys, like just in terms of the security stuff. And then I would take a step back and be like, they've killed 2 people in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
They have shot 2 people who were part of these networks, on camera, who are part of these networks, who are literally doing this kind of thing. They've killed 2 of them in 3 weeks. Like, that's not abstract at all. I mean, there's been 3 homicides in Minneapolis all year. 1 non-ICE and 2 by DHS. Jake.
I hadn't thought about it until we started talking, but the only other time that I've had an experience comparable to what the federal agents are doing to the people in America is when I was in Ukraine in the early weeks of the war. And there was, if I remember the story correctly, I had just cleared a live shot on the Today Show at a bakery in Lviv. And I think we were just kind of hanging out in the street outside, and our security guy from, like, these guys are like British Special Services or whatever, say to us and the crew, like, we got to go. We're being watched. And I'm not trying to be too dramatic about it. We were in Lviv. We weren't in Kyiv. We weren't, where it was particularly hot. But we had to get the hell out of there, because these guys were concerned enough that agents of whatever state, likely Ukraine, just being suspicious of us, were trailing us through the streets because they didn't know who we were or what we were doing. That's exactly what it feels like to be in Minneapolis right now, especially over the last 2 weeks. And that feeling has escalated since I started covering all this in LA at the beginning of June on your show that first night. The agents themselves haven't changed. The fact that it's the elite Border Patrol units kitted up in their costumes like they're going out into the military theater, which is the word that Tom Homan used, as you pointed out the other night. But their counter surveillance stuff has just gotten more and more and more intense. And I know in Chicago, I rolled up on the aftermath of a couple of apprehensions. I didn't see it as much, although Bovino and those guys were walking down Michigan Avenue in their outfits looking ridiculous. But when I got to Charlotte is when I really did notice it. And they're driving down the street looking at you just like you're looking at them when you cross paths with them. And Connor, the photographer for MS, who I was with, said to me when I was there last week, before the killing of Preddy, Look at them. They're looking at us and they're clocking us and they're trying to figure out where we're going and what we're doing just as much as we're doing the same with them. And I think it's part of the reason why the network stopped letting journalists into the Signal chats, and you have to sort of be relayed secondhand, or like you did, Chris, driving around in the car with them, telling you where to go. But when we rolled up on Bovino, after he had thrown the tear gas canister and he had left, but on that scene or the scene minutes before that, when they smashed a window and pulled someone out of the car, we knew about that because we were tipped off by people in these networks who do not feel safe even sharing with us now. The minute by minute, you have to get it secondhand in order to arrive on the scene of these places. And I don't blame them. It is really, really scary to get face to face with these guys, given the way that they have been operating.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
We were outside Whipple, the detention center, and to the point of being monitored, they have a drone flying stationary up there. Just in case you thought that you weren't being clocked by the feds and they weren't using facial recognition technology and the drone wasn't capturing your image, you're in there.
You had an experience at Whipple that I want you to talk about, Alex, and it connects to something else that I've been thinking a lot about is the critique that people would offer a lot of the kind of anti-Trump resistance in quotation marks, particularly in Trump 1.0, was a kind of, let's say, virtue signaling. Right. And like, I don't, there's so many critiques of liberals that are like, of course, true, because like, yes, are there lots of things that liberals do that are annoying? Absolutely. And was there a lot of virtue signaling, and did some of the language get like super precious and, a little hard to take or a little like weirdly alienating for people who weren't read in? All of that, I think, yes, like there was some truth to those critiques. But what I kept thinking about what was happening in Minnesota was like the complete opposite of that. Mm-hmm. No one wanted, everyone's doing it in secret. No one's like, people aren't posting about it. This is pure action, zero signaling. This is people quietly, anonymously, in the dark of night, sometimes moving people from house to house. These are medical care providers going to do like in-home medical care. I mean, so it's like pure work. And I was trying to say, I think I said in Ari Melber show, where he's asking about the protests and the protesters, and I'm like, protest doesn't really capture what's happening here. It's not really protest. It's civil resistance. It's like people doing stuff all the time to basically try to stick a crowbar in the machinery of the mass deportation machine. Yeah. But it's not like, I mean, there was obviously a huge protest that happened, a day before Alex Preddy was shot. It's not like that's not happening. There are protesters at Whipple and stuff like that. But 99% of it's not protest in any recognizable form, including like what you saw at Whipple in terms of what they have created when someone is released from that building. Whipple is a federal building near the airport where someone's released from detention.
So we went to Whipple. To just kind of check out the scene and see what was happening. And it was, I think, like 7:00 at night. And needless to say, it was like, it's just insanely cold. But there are people outside of Whipple 24/7. And there are some people that are wearing these kind of orange vests and they look kind of official, but they're a volunteer network. I don't want to name the organization because I'm not entirely sure. And they probably don't want the credit to begin with. Yep. It's all virtue, no signal. And we were there and all of a sudden there are people.
I want that bumper sticker.
Yeah, all virtue, no signal. Exactly.
Well, that would sort of defeat the whole signal, no signal
exactly.
part of it. But anyway.
But I there's no irony in my life.
Right. Got it. Roger. That actually is funnier. Okay. So we're standing out there and people are constantly heckling the ICE agents that are driving in and out of the detention center. But the cheers, the noise went from heckling to cheering. And so we looked over and we see this guy being led out of the detention center by a federal agent of some sort, and let go. He is clutching a sheaf of papers, and he's clearly someone who's been detained and is now being released. That same night was the night a judge ordered all the refugees that have been swept up in like the second part of the federal invasion of Minnesota that was the night that the judge ordered those refugees released from detention. So he may have been a refugee. I'm not sure why he was being released. But these people, as we all know by now, have been snatched without any of their belongings, taken into custody. They don't have coats, they don't have mittens, they don't have anything. And then when they're released, they all equally have nothing. So this guy gets out and he crosses the street. And it's like those videos you see of hostage exchanges where the person is just completely disoriented and is like shoved back into freedom. And on the other side of the street where we were standing, one of these people in the orange vests basically catches the guy and gives him her mittens and gives him a hat. And he's like, she didn't speak Spanish. Again, this is a completely self-directed network of people, and she walks him and escorts him, and she's like, we're gonna get you into a car, we're gonna give you a ride. And I believe they gave him a burner phone so that he could make his way back to safety and familiar surroundings. And it was so emotional. First of all, just to see someone who's clearly been through hell. This guy's in like a thin shirt. He doesn't speak much English. And, God knows what he's been through in detention, is shoved out into the night with nothing. But then also to see the goodness and the organization and the bravery of these strangers who just stay out there hoping that they can help someone in a way that will maybe redirect the course of their life or their immediate, next couple weeks. It was so moving. It was actually I think one of the most stunning things I'd seen. And then I thought about, it made me think actually differently about the ring of protesters that surround Whipple, because when the detainees get deported, they get loaded into these buses, and we actually have tape of one of those buses driving away. And the last thing they really see is a group of people from behind a chain link fence, shouting in solidarity with them. And I actually think it's God, your fucking whole idea of America must be so upended when you go through this and you're being sent out of this country and from the life you built. But at least there's a group of people telling you we know this isn't okay. We are with you. Even if we can't do anything about what's happening to you right now, you matter and what's happening to you matters. It made me feel it was really affirming. The power of both the protest and the action was incredibly, I don't know. I felt better about our country, even as bad as I feel about it because of what's happening en masse.
Me too. And as much as the Border Patrol has evolved their tactics, I've seen them evolve on the other side of the nonviolent resistance since LA. And I went out with Union del Barrio in LA. The thing about these people is they're just regular people. They want to be. The administration wants to paint them as agitators, Antifa, far left radicals, all that shit that they say. And they are people with normal jobs. So Union del Barrio, it's more often than I've had teachers in almost every city. I went out with a teacher, an educator, and they just spend half their day when they're not in the school driving around watching primarily at Home Depots in LA. And then in Chicago, I met people on the street who was the first time I saw the whistles. And that had sort of evolved out of LA. And then in Charlotte, I went to this thing, Siembra, North Carolina, in a Methodist church on a Monday night. 300 people showed up. And that's the first time I saw the vests. And they all were wearing the vests. And then and by the way, 26 Federal Plaza, same deal. It's they have it down to a science of people to go in there and try to intervene, or at least document who's getting taken when they walk out the door. And then when we got to Minneapolis, it was all of the stuff. It was best practices of all of the things that I had seen over the course of the last 7 months. And if there's any redeeming part of any of this, is that it has become a science for these folks, not in a way that they're colluding with the Walz administration or Gavin Newsom or J.B. Pritzker, but that they are just fucking awesome human beings who care about other people, who are taking the time to learn, whether it's online in these sessions, and thousands of people are showing up to these sessions online, or in a church on a Monday night or whatever. In a way, it's their tactics are more dialed in than the sloppy Border Patrol dudes running around throwing tear gas canisters to raise absolute hell.
One of the organizers I talked to in Minnesota said his estimate was that 100,000 people have gone through training. In the Twin Cities, which is
Bavino said at one of those press conferences, we haven't been up, and I'm paraphrasing, but we haven't been up against an opposition so well organized until we got to Minneapolis.
Well, so Jacob, because you do have a unique perspective here, because you have been you've been in LA, Chicago, Charlotte, and tracking this, and then of course also have been covering immigration policy for years. what I'm trying to get my arms around why Minnesota's been so different, and I feel one of the reasons is just sheer numbers. Like they have 13% of all their agents. They've got 3,000.
3,000 is crazy. More, isn't it more? Isn't the stat that it's like 1,000 more than the Minneapolis Police Department?
I think it's 3 to 1. I think it's 3 to 1.
Wow.
I think there's 3 federal agents for every police officer in the Twin Cities. Is the stat that I heard. So yeah, I guess why has it been like it? In some ways, I know people in Chicago really well and was very like keyed into what was going on there. And in some ways, there's a lot of similarities. But I think it was like the scale and the kind of oppressive ubiquity in Minnesota that felt different.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if that is how you would describe what's different about Minnesota.
Well, first of all, the other raids happened in the middle of summer. And I think it was much easier for people to get out and protest right away. And so in LA, No King's Day was, I guess, the 14th of June, and these things started on the 7th. So it was like a week after. You had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets because this protest had already been organized in Chicago. I was live with you on the air while marching down Michigan Avenue when spontaneously tens of thousands of people in the fall. It was still pretty warm. It was Cubs were playing a playoff game that night. Like everybody went out to the streets. In Minnesota, there had been protests, but nothing on the scale of what we saw last Friday, the day before Preddy was shot and killed. And that, I think, really, this is just my opinion, probably freaked out Bovino, and they ratcheted up their enforcement. The next day, they just said, let's go out and do, have you seen that video when he was in LA? They came out in the Chicago court case where basically they said, whose city is this? It's our fucking city. Yep. We're going to bring in a tractor trailer of less lethal munitions and, moral, ethical, legal, but wink, wink, it was the whole speech. Yeah. And I think that's the message. If you saw him give it in LA, he's been giving it to them all along. I think for a couple weeks in Minnesota, they got to do it and didn't feel like the opposition was as big as maybe the ones that scared them out of LA and Chicago and Charlotte. And then this thing happened and it kind of tore apart their whole, the protest. They're, I think they went harder than ever. They killed Preddy. And then it all started to fall apart from them. But I do think that perhaps, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from someone in Minnesota who said, no, we were organized. I think that's true, but I don't think I think their tactics increased. And I think the protests might have come on a little bit later in such a wide scale that it was allowed them to do their thing for this extended period of time. Until the whole nation really started paying attention.
I think I just think the numbers, like, I think it's just the match of how many people they have and how many people are in the area.
Yeah.
Los Angeles metro area is what, 15 million people or something. I mean, it's like, it's larger than many states.
The most populous county in the country. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So it seems to me like because that was the thing that everyone would say is like, everyone was 1 degree removed from it. Everyone had seen an abduction or had an interaction or had been on a street with tear gas. And I think, the one thing that I think is encouraging is that they don't have the person power to sustain this in a lot of different places or for this very long. I mean, they might, once they get through this insane, $85 billion that the big bill gave them.
Well, but I think we also, Minnesota's George Floyd, right? But Minnesota's a target because Trump's obsessed with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and all that.
Also, Wall said to me because he lost Minnesota 3 times.
Yes. Right. And he and like not with a huge margin either. So I think he's obsessed with that. But I think you have to take into consideration the fact that after George Floyd, there's a robust spirit of like civic engagement in Minnesota and in the Midwest, and there are real lessons learned from George Floyd. And so once that activist community is active, they're think bolder and braver and out there in a more concentrated way, perhaps. And then I also think after George Floyd, the Minneapolis Police Department really changed the way it policed, and so that created a situation where you have real tension between local police and the feds that are marching in, and you have a mayor saying, get the fuck out of here. And so there was this a tension that like a powder keg kind of scenario that existed in Minneapolis that doesn't necessarily exist. I talked to the former LA police chief, there's a different attitude in those big city police chiefs than there is in Minnesota or in Minneapolis in those police chiefs. And you can see it on the ground. Like,
and
activists have a much different relationship with police on the ground. They're much more aligned in Minneapolis, which I think made the whole thing more tense.
In Chicago, remember, we saw the Chicago Police Department engaged in some of the clashes with the protesters. In LA, when I was on the air in those early days, it was the LA Sheriff's Department who were firing less lethals at us, charging us with horses because they were put in between the feds and the protesters in a way that I don't think probably those local law enforcement guys didn't want to have. Jim McDonald, the chief of the LAPD, I think signaled some willingness to work with the feds early on. And you're so right that in Minneapolis, from the jump, it was, we're not a part of this shit.
One of the things that was interesting about being there and talking to people is that the nature of the way the news cycle works and the way that my job works and that all our jobs work is that like the comet streaks across the sky and you cover it and then you go to the next thing. And obviously we all covered 2020 and George Floyd, extensively. But it was really interesting to talk to people about like what the aftermath of that was like what's been happening there for the last 5 years after all the cameras left, after the very difficult conversations and pieces of legislation and changes to policy and relationships between city council members in the police department and community members in the police department, and even like the trauma of it in a bunch of different directions, the trauma of the death of George Floyd and the violation of trust that represented, also the the property damage that happened, the basically kind of police strike that happened afterwards in which people couldn't really call the cops. and so there's all these different, there's a story that I did not know about how much work everyone in that community has put in after George Floyd.
Yeah.
About to like rebuild a lot of those relationships and to change things for the better, which I think have been very successful. I don't think there's any final victory at all. And I'm sure there are people that will tell you they could spend an hour on this podcast talking about their complaints about the MPD.
Yes.
But it does seem like a lot of work was done. And that work is very present and palpable in what's happening now.
Well, and I would say, like, one of the things that you always notice and that you hear from people who are involved in scuffles or outright, kind of combat and violence with federal agents is the police were nowhere to be found. And that is a decision on the part of the police not to get involved in this stuff and not to be, like, to your point, Jacob, about how it was in LA. But that also, I think, made for these situations that wouldn't normally exist, right? Where you just have hand-to-hand combat between these untrained ICE agents dragging people across the street, pepper spraying them at point blank.
Slipping on the ice, like just the most ridiculous looking law enforcement operation you could possibly imagine.
And not having any fucking idea. But I think things escalated in some ways because I'm not blaming any of this on MPD, but I'm just saying the sort of their reluctance to be seen as tacitly endorsing the tactics of ICE kept them at a distance. And I think as a result, you just had this insanely up close relationship between, and you have it, protesters.
It's so true. Without the backup of the local law enforcement, Emperor had no clothes, and they're slipping on the ice. And their tactics are laid bare, which is a lack of tactics and training to be in urban policing environments. They don't understand what community-based policing is. They don't understand what it means to be. So Border Patrol, BORTAC, the elite tactical unit, is the one that's surrounding Bovino. I've been out with BORSTAR, which is their counterpart that goes and rescues people in the middle of the Arizona desert in the middle of the night. And they want to tell you we're lifesavers. We go out there, we're going to helicopter in, we're going to jump in, in a monsoon and save migrants that are crossing. These guys have no idea what it's like to police in an American city. And without the actual cops that do the policing, they're just out there looking like total, I wouldn't say goofballs, but it's deadly serious,
Well, and also, I mean, the other thing that's so apparent in this entire thing is the role that legitimacy and consent of the governed plays in all of this. Because I've covered police and community interactions and relationships for, over a decade. My second book was in some parts about it. I was in Ferguson. I was in Baltimore. I've been the middle of protests. I've been in the middle of riots. I've been in the middle of police riots, frankly. There are moments where that legitimacy between the police and the police completely goes away.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not generally the case that, for instance, the NYPD, when they walk down the street, are being cursed out and told to get the F out of our streets. Like that will happen at peak moments of tension. But every single place these people are going in these cities, they have zero legitimacy. And the reason is because the thing they're doing, the project they're engaged in, people have conflicted feelings about the police, I think, a lot. But there's not a lot of conflicted feelings about these guys running around these cities.
None.
It's like, you don't belong here. We don't want you here. It's not like, well, if I'm in trouble, I'm going to call the police and I have this, none of that. There's zero legitimacy. And so it totally changes the dynamic to all of it, because they're running around and every single person is like, get out of here. We don't want you.
But it also gave the Trump administration the closest opportunity it's had yet to do what they've wanted to do all along, is use all this as a pretext to invoke the Insurrection Act. Mm-hmm. So I actually do think that these circumstances is what they've been looking for in a city where the local law enforcement truly doesn't play ball with them, where the mayor and the governor truly are doing everything they can to keep them out and kick them out as quickly as they can. Because they thought these clashes would lead to, they had troops on standby during all of this, Army troops. And were it not for the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, they may have very well done that, I think. But now I'm not sure they're going to have that opportunity.
I wonder what... I kept asking people there, like, how long could you keep this up? Because, there's a one of my favorite quotes, and it might be apocryphal. I think it's Oscar Wilde. The problem with socialism is it takes up too many evenings. And which, because, I said this the other day, in the great Taylor Branch civil rights king biography, the first one, Parting the Waters, there's a several chapters on the Montgomery bus boycott. And the way that we think about the Montgomery bus boycott is Rosa Parks, and then the boycott, and then they win. The boycott part of it is, I think, over a year, and involves basically the civil rights organizers and the black churches of Montgomery standing up a completely alternate public transportation system to get everyone, all the black folks there have jobs and can't afford not to work. They all are all taking the bus. They all need to get to work still. And so basically the civil rights organizers spend a year running an alternative transit program, which is the key, like, logistical thing that allows them to win the boycott, right? They end up getting victory. And the thing I kept asking people in Minnesota is, like, how long, because people are like, now it's just part of my life. I go to school patrol. I do my grocery run. How long can you keep this up? It does feel like a...
What did that guy say to you outside? Didn't he say something about how winter's not over till May? What did you had on the show?
The pastor who had a great line to me, he said, here in Minnesota, we have a term called, when does the ice go out? When does ice go out? And that means when the lakes are no longer frozen over. And he said, in my youth, people would even drive old cars they didn't want anymore, and they park them on the lake, and they take bets on when it would fall through the ice. He's like, so we Minnesotans, we know about ice out, and we know how to wait until the ice is out.
Yeah, they sure fucking do, don't they? Well, I got to say, though, I mean, I think this is not just a political gesture, right? This is most of the people, I mean, some of the people, the detention of migrants doesn't immediately impact their lives, but the school patrols and the shepherding of teachers back and forth, that's because those parents are worried about the impacts.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
This is going to happen. And I talked to this one mom, and she said, I sometimes feel bad for myself, right? And I'm sort of like, how dare I feel bad? But I have all this organizing to do, and I have a day job, and my evenings are with my kids. That's like when I see my kids. And now I have my phone with me. I have my work that I need to do, and I am taking away time that I'm losing time in which I mother to help other people's children and help these teachers. And that makes me feel really bad. But then I think, like, who the fuck am I to complain, right? Like, who am I to even feel like this is a hardship given what these other people are facing? But she said, I mean, to be honest, I mean, we're worried that people after a certain while will just give up on trying to teach and they'll just do something else or they'll leave. And then we'll have to change schools, you know, like, and she's like, and we've started to have to make plans for that. In addition to that, her kids can no longer go outside. They don't have outdoor playtime anymore because they're worried ICE is going to come and steal the teachers in the middle of the school day. And they have to keep the shades drawn all day in the classrooms. And it's like, okay, at a point, like the sacrifices you're making as a mother, you can account for and you can absorb those. But I do think there's a tipping point at which you're like, my children are suffering. Like, and if I have an alternative route to just like extricate myself from this situation entirely for their good, you know, that becomes, you know, a choice that people are maybe going to have to make depending on how long this goes on.
There's also this like normalization question, you know, which, you know, it's clear that they want to, you know, we overuse this term with Trump all the time, normalize. But the reason I think it's a potent and useful thing is because humans are just super adaptable. You know, when you read the Diary of Anne Frank, it's like she talks about the rhythms they fall into and the routines of this like completely awful, you know, situation they're in where they can't go outside. And, you know, people adapt to different things. And the idea that it just becomes normal that there's federal agents circling around and grabbing people out of cars. Now, I think that's why the level of outrage has been so important. And I think, you know, I don't necessarily think they're serious about stepping back, but I do think at least like them beating a little bit of a rhetorical retreat is important. But Jacob, like the thing about this is Stephen Miller's project is the mass deportation and frankly ethnic cleansing of the country. Like he hasn't quite put it in those terms, but he's come pretty close. There's an interview he does with Steve Bannon many years ago where he talks about like how many South Asian CEOs there are that like gives away the game a little bit. It was like, wow, well, wait a second. That has nothing to do, like they're all here legally, right? Like, you know, there is this desire to mass purge. I mean, millions and millions and millions of people.
I couldn't fucking believe my eyes when I walked into the arena for the Republican convention that night and I saw thousands of signs that said mass deportation. Now, I wanted to go up to the people and say, excuse me, are you aware of what that actually means?
Totally.
Do you understand?
I believe you did.
But again,
I believe you actually did.
Do you understand what that sign means and what it is based on? It is based on a program that deported 1 million Mexicans and American citizens from this country, who many of them through the Bracero program were legally here in the first place, even if they were undocumented, and ruined the lives of a generation of people. And you're fucking got balloons falling from the sky and partying as you hold up these signs, dancing with a cheese head on. It is preposterous, but that is what this is. And Stephen Miller in the first term didn't just want to separate 5,500 kids before it was stopped by that Republican judge in California. He wanted to use a process known as administrative separations to separate 25,000 or more. And because the policy stopped, he was stopped from doing that. But this has been his dream all along. What is mass? This is family separation. You pick it's supersized. It's on steroids. This is exactly what they wanted to do the first time around. And they are not going to stop. Tom Homan coming in. I couldn't believe how Walz, frankly, was talking about it when he first started talking about that he was hopeful or optimistic that they were sending Homan and he was a law enforcement professional. And when I sat down, you should watch the full YouTube interview of the interview we put on your show, Chris, because in the extended version, I basically lay it out for him. I said, are you aware of who this guy actually is and the things that he's done?
What I said to folks here and folks on the street were saying this, and I agree with them, is that I said Tom Homan is more of a professional. Tom Homan called me, not something Bravino or Noam would ever do. But the fear I have with that is it we going to get more of the same, but more efficient at this oppression.
Well, he's
more
one of the
efficient.
most extreme people when it comes to immigration policy in the federal
That's
government.
right. And I think that's the fear. I think right now, though, that Tom Homan's taken his marching orders from the president. And what I understood, and the reason that I believe there's an opportunity for something to do here, because just to be very clear, what the White House wants is for these scenes on the streets to stop, because it's tanking their approval ratings. And according to the president, it looks bad. If Tom Homan does anything here that makes that continue on, the president's going to be on him.
Tom Homan he was the intellectual father of the family separation policy. Go read Caitlin Dickerson's Pulitzer Prize winning piece for The Atlantic about it. You want to talk about worst of the worst. These are the worst of the worst when it comes to not caring about humanity, not caring about people as people, in immigration policy in a generation, despite decades of this approach to immigration and under Democrats and Republicans.
But my thing about this, to go back to that legitimacy point, is that what you're seeing in Minnesota is that, like, no one will collaborate with it. I mean, as far as I can tell, there's literally no one there who's like helping them. I mean, maybe there's people silently who think it's good, but I mean, maybe, there must be.
I think maybe you'll get a conservative sheriff in a conservative county that wants to honor the detainer request, possibly.
Right. But
by the way, the state already does. The state hands over the worst of the worst.
Yes. But the general feeling there is like, this has no legitimacy. This is essentially tyranny, and it's a foreign occupation. And I think there was a similar response. We just saw this in Maine. I mean, it was a smaller version, but a kind of similar thing played out in Maine. Nowhere near the sheer number of officers, but also Maine's a smaller place. They were also met with mutual aid networks, whistles, like all of that. They say they're now leaving and redeploying. Susan Collins is trying to take credit for it, but I think that's highly dubious. And the governor.
Oh,
Janet Mills,
Susan Collins.
Yeah.
She's always concerned.
Yeah.
Concerned is her favorite word.
He's been calling her out on that as is Graham Plattner, who are of course both running for Senate. But I guess my point is, one of the things I saw there is that one of the reasons that this project of essentially purging immigrants from cutting them out of the national fabric and the authoritarian project are so intertwined is because there's actually no sufficient consent for the former. Like, there isn't, like, people don't want it. And so the only way to do it, maybe some people thought they wanted it or didn't understand what they were signing up for, but on the ground, and particularly in these places, there is no consent for it, and it is not a legitimate project at some fundamental, deep, small d democratic level, which means the only way to do it is through sort of authoritarian means.
Occupation.
Right?
And that's how Trump is thinking about it. That's what Walz said in their phone call. Walz goes, he compared what's happening in Minnesota to Venezuela, and he goes, hey, Tim, you see what we did in Venezuela?
Yeah, basically being like, didn't we do such a good job in Venezuela?
Yes.
Like, why is it going awry in Minneapolis?
Well, I mean, I think they've painted themselves into a corner. There's no way you get mass deportations without brutal tactics like this.
Yes.
Right.
And without picking up totally innocent people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You just can't get the numbers, and they've announced the numbers, and they want the numbers because it's a larger authoritarian project of ethnic cleansing. I completely agree with you, which dovetails with their white Christian nationalist agenda to like repopulate the country and have all white women stop going to high, institutions of higher learning, which are already corrupted by liberals, and having babies before the age of 30 and then getting tax credits for every child that they have. And, but don't call it a social safety net. Like, it's all of a piece, right? But that is problematic because it's so essential to their broader project. They can't just abandon it. And I don't know what they do, but like, there's nowhere to go to get 3,000. I don't know. What is the average? Does anybody know? Is it 3,000 a day that they need to deport?
A day. That's what Miller wants.
Like,
yeah.
you
That's
can't,
what he wants, yeah.
like, but it's not just in service of like racism and just making brown people live in fear. It's also just, they want to reinvent this country, and like getting all the brown people out or self-deport and making them self-deport is essential to that project. So they both can't abandon the goal, but they also can't execute it like this.
Right. They can't achieve it.
Yeah. And so
I don't think.
I do think the work of the Democrats now is to understand that, like, it's just about throwing as much sand in the gears as you possibly can in whatever way. And I know we don't have to talk about everything that's happening in Congress right now, but
no, I want to talk about the Democrats.
I think I will go back to this one thing, and I'm like too Freudian about all of this. Is it Freud? Is it Jung? I don't even know. I just like go to therapy sometimes. But
I have two therapists.
Well, I mean, I do too.
Congrats. That's great.
Don't we all
Thank
need
you.
multiple? Like, we need to.
Yes.
You're my therapist. My therapists are Jacob Soboroff and Chris
This
Hayes.
is my third therapy
This is it.
session of the week. Yeah.
I'm paying a lot of money for this hour. But like the mask
On
element,
MS Now Premium, you actually are.
the fact that these agents operate in masks, I think is really meaningful, both in terms of like the public's mistrust of them, in addition to all the reasons that the public legitimately should not trust them. It's a signal that the ICE agents don't feel like they're legitimate, but it also gives them impunity. And I think it allows them to dehumanize people and it gives them a permission structure to dehumanize and brutalize other people. And I do think we kind of talk about what is going to throw sand in the gears, and there are all sorts of judicial and legislative mechanisms that should be employed. But I do think the simple thing of making these people show their faces is actually really meaningful. I was talking to really a pastor at the Park Avenue United Methodist Church in Minneapolis, and I said, if you could ask ICE agents anything, his whole congregation has been upended by these ICE raids. So if you could ask these ICE agents anything, what would you ask them? And he paused and he did the thing where it was like he said, you could feel it was like legitimately his question. He said, I want to know if you're the same person when you're not wearing the mask.
Oof, wow.
And I do think it's a big deal. I mean,
huge deal. Huge deal.
I don't think we should undercount or undersell how much it matters.
I totally agree for two reasons. One is there's a reason that the phrase secret police has a specific force to it. And it's because in a non-free society, the police are secret, and in a free society, they are not. And so, and the inversion of the privacy interest here is so perverse. They now are asserting a privacy interest while armed and being equipped and paid by public dollars to not be revealed, whereas private citizens are now being face scanned and entered into a database and have no privacy interest. It is completely backwards.
They're using travel data at the airport to go find people as they check in for their flights. Yeah. Every piece of data that exists out there right now, to them, if they could have their hands on it, they would, to figure out who's undocumented. They tried to do it during family separation. Scott Lloyd wanted to know when women in custody were having periods to track undocumented women in custody and to find them and deport them. This has been a project since Trump won, and now they're finally getting to do this.
And they have better technical means of doing it. Palantir is actually quite good at this in a technical sense.
Alex
of like,
Karp.
Yeah, merging data. Like that's their whole thing, is merging databases, basically, from what I can tell the people that I've talked to and reported on Palantir a little bit. But to go back to your point about like, okay, how do you throw sand in the gears, right? That all of this really is happening at this real, almost logistical level. Like it doesn't have any legitimacy. There's protests, but there's also, we're going to just make it as hard for you. And what role the Democratic opposition party has in. And I'm just going to fire off a hot take here, which has been simmering in me. So I think I use this expression a lot, kicking the dog, which is like you're frustrated and angry and the dog is underneath the table, so you kick it because the thing you're angry at, you can't you can't go at. Obviously, you shouldn't kick your dog. I don't actually do that. But just this idea of like you're taking out your frustration on the nearest proximate thing. And there's a lot of anger at the Democrats right now, some of which I think is like completely legitimate and I get. But I also think there's something a little weird about, like, fundamentally it is the case that the biggest failure of the Democrats that brought us to this moment is they lost the 2024 election.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons they lost the 2024 election was because enough voters chose Donald Trump specifically on immigration over Kamala Harris. Like, we have the data that shows the number one thing was cost of living, inflation, and the economy, and basically the number two was immigration. Democrats were way underwater on immigration. They are still right now, Republicans are +9 for the party that people trust in immigration.
Wow.
So they lost an election they had to win to prevent this from happening, even though it was clear as day that this is what they were going to do if they got elected. They now don't have a majority in either house. The one big garbage bill got passed with 0 Democratic votes and gave $85 billion to these agencies, meaning it's going to be funded even if they don't pass this stopgap measure. They got a ton of money in the bank. So there are things they should be doing tactically to try to slow down and break this as any way they can.
Yes.
100%. But fundamentally, they're almost a side issue. Like like when I think back to family separation, it was mass resistance basically by people and moral revulsion that basically broke Trump, and he retreated. It wasn't that they got and there was a judicial avenue, but it wasn't like some piece of legislation, because the other thing is they could get legislation and he'll promptly ignore it. It's 45 days past the Epstein deadline. They've blown through that. So like, it just seems to me that like, I understand people's frustration with the Democratic Party messaging. I get all that. I just think there's a little bit of weird misdirection in terms of how much people are focusing on them, when to me, they're a little bit ancillary to stopping this.
The thing that stopped family separation, as you said, was hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people coming to the streets in a way that we haven't seen until now. The Pope spoke out at the time. As I said to you the other day, it wasn't even an English-speaking Pope from Chicago. Donald Trump said, "I didn't like the sight and the feeling of the families being separated," responding to that Ginger Thompson ProPublica audio of the Border Patrol agents at a signing ceremony where, as you pointed out the other night, Chris, he was undoing the policy that he himself and the woman standing behind him, Kirstjen Nielsen, put into place with a different signature, option 3 in the secretarial decision memo.
Yeah.
It was the public pressure and only the public pressure. And you're right, through legal avenues, Legal Learn and the ACLU, went to Dana Sabra in the Southern District of California.
And that avenue is important here as well, to be clear. Like, I think they've got shots at winning these cases, even though they've been killed on the shadow docket. Like, I think what's happening is like so clearly unconstitutional, you might even be able to win at the Supreme Court.
And at a moment where Joaquin Castro and some other people went and said, we could ban the practice of family separation outright entirely right now, even there was a moral opposition on the Republican side, they didn't do it then. And so do I think that there's going to be some legislative fix that makes people say, oh, the Democrats are the solution here? No, I don't. Because, by the way, I don't give Joe Biden any credit. He promised a fair, safe, humane, orderly immigration system. And all he ended up doing was leaning back into the same deterrence-based, punitive-based policies that sent, I went to Haiti, people to their surefire death in Haiti, allowed Ukrainians to come in. It was the most incongruous, bizarre immigration policy, maybe in the last 5-6 presidencies. They don't deserve any credit. They didn't. Even their family separation task force, he backed away from giving financial restitution to them in the face of a question from Peter Doocy at the White House. It was pretty shameful, actually. And so I'm not surprised that they are in the position they are in now, and it's not them who's going to stop this ultimately.
Well, but let me say one more thing, just again on that like, it was also the case. And again, I'm sounding like I'm caping for the Democrats here. I don't actually care, because I think this is important. People's instincts on immigration are actually complex and cross-pressured. Mm-hmm. And it is actually the case that there was a right-wing backlash to too many people coming over the border. Like, It just was the case. And
even in Democratic cities, people didn't like seeing
I cannot
people
tell
show
you
up
the
at
amount
shelters
of working class New Yorkers that I had conversations with.
No, that was real.
Black and brown folks about, do you hear they're getting $200 debit cards? Like, what's like, it was absolutely a real thing. It was not just a fabrication of Fox News. It wasn't, there was actual backlash. Mm-hmm. This kind of backlash, by the way, isn't just unique to the US. It's been roiling global politics and killing left and center left parties all over the world. There's an enormous backlash in South Korea. There was an enormous backlash in Colombia to Venezuelan immigrants. They just kicked hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees out of Pakistan. Like, these are not that feeling of like, I don't want all these people here. I feel overrun. I feel that's a real thing in politics in every democratic society on earth. And you have to take it head on and deal with it and talk about it and persuade your way out of it. What happened with Biden to me was like this crazy mismatch of we're going to have a record number of people, literally Ellis Island numbers per day, literally like peak the moment we all think about is like iconic American, give us you're tired, you're poor. We were having that number of people a day, which again, I'm a bleeding heart lib. Let them come. Like I got like, if you ask me, if I'm the king of the world, you ask like, what are my personal commitments? Like, yeah, but people didn't like that. And there's like a hangover in Democratic politics. And what you ended up with in Biden was this weird combination of a record number of people coming and no one making any affirmative case for what the actual vision was. It was like, let's just not talk about it. And you've still got this weird hangover of like, let's not talk about immigration. We're reactive. Like you have to tell a story. What kind of nation do you want? What are the role of immigrants? Why is immigration good? Like you have to tell all these stories to people. And I just feel like there's a total lack of that.
So you're saying you don't think bipartisan immigration reform is going to happen anytime soon?
I don't. Although, there is, I definitely do think like the Nixon to China thing about Trump being the one person who could sign it is not totally wrong.
Yeah.
Guys,
except that
prediction, he's going to sign an amnesty bill before the end of the term.
You think so?
No, but honestly, you are right though. If there was anybody to do something totally and completely wacky,
well,
Reagan did it.
We should note that the big thing they say now, they want the German system for Turks. And people don't know this. Like, there is a status that Turkish immigrants who were brought to Germany because they had labor shortages have, in which they are lawful residents, permanent residents, but they can't be citizens. And there's like multiple generations of folks who are German in every way, except they're not German citizens. We have birthright citizenship. They're trying to destroy that. And we don't believe in that. I think we've got a better way of doing this. But that's basically what they want. That's
the country would look nothing like it does if we had that system in place for any long period of time.
Right, because they hate the way the country looks. That's exactly right.
Yeah, well,
yes.
Talk to the waves of Italian and Irish immigrants about what a caste system would have done for them, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's just the whole promise of America is not that system.
But that is exactly the thing. I mean, and that's why I think there's an argument to be made that's a winning argument. When you say the whole promise of America is like, I truly believe, and I feel like we saw it on the streets of Minnesota, this neighborism, which is the term Adam Serwer used for it, like, seriously, like, it's not even some newfangled, like, quote unquote woke thing. We're talking old patriotic pluralism melting pot stuff. Like, what they are attacking is so elemental that it's like the kind of like almost cliche stuff that you would get in first grade.
Yes.
It's not like some newfangled critical
race
theory thing. But the point is that there's an argument to make that's a winning argument.
Well,
because
and
I think people still believe in it.
And a very simple, I mean, the great utility of what Trump's doing is he's burning their argument down to the ground.
Yes.
And it leaves a huge playing field for someone to make a pretty basic argument about American values and how that should undergird immigration policy.
About humanity. Just to remind everybody, my personal opinion about why Joe Biden won the 2020 election is the final debate when Kristen Welker was moderating. She asked him a question about the 545 still separated children who had not yet been reunited 2 years after the family separation policy. And Trump totally crapped the bed on his answer, and Biden basically made an answer all about humanity. Nobody talks in terms of humanity anymore. Castro's down there visiting Liam Ramos, but everybody else, I just don't see it. I don't see them say, these are, the argument that I make from my neighborhood is, the people they're going after in Los Angeles, I've said this to both of you, are the people engaged in rebuilding Los Angeles after the costliest wildfire event in American history. That's who the Republicans are targeting right now. People who are actually trying to help all of us. And they just don't talk like that. They just don't talk like that.
You got to make the argument that it's not like whatever. There's the tactics of throwing sand in the gears. There's the strategy, but there's got to be a vision and an argument about what makes us different and special. And you don't have to, I really don't think this is a reinvent the wheel thing. Like you're building on literally generations of essentially civic religion, even propaganda, frankly. I mean, that has been built up. It's like, yes, this is the thing that makes us special. There's the Ronald Reagan speech about if you're not from France, you can never be a Frenchman. But anyone can be an American. Like, there's deep gut stuff to draw on here, but you got to start doing it forcefully. And I'm hopeful that this is a moment to seize that. Jacob Soboroff is MS Now senior political and national reporter. Alex Wagner is MS Now senior political analyst, host of the podcast Runaway Country.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bud.